Hi, Isaac. This is our
Rafa, yeah,
this is our
yeah.
shortened version. As again, unfortunately, I lost the recording, so we're really only going to do one verse quickly and try to get the main points out just for our edification. The 30 minutes, we generally can't do lishma learning. That's just for its own sake. The 30 minutes that we spent in this verse earlier were amazing, and we'll get a short version, but they are really just for the gods now because it doesn't exist.
Amen. Okay, on that note, is it verse 5 or verse 6?
It was verse 7. No.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yes, my bad. Yeah, verse 7. The Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 3, verse 7. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?"
Okay, wow, what an amazing verse. And we're just going to go point by point. So number one point is that there's many different translations for brood. It could be family, or it could be a group of. So it's sorry. What would you like?
So can we also touch base on the Pharisees and the Sadducees?
Oh
Like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
if from a Christian perspective, I look it's one, but like
Yeah.
you mentioned that again, these are two distinct
We'll
groups
start
with
with
two.
Pharisees and Sadducees. So when we look at Josephus, when he lists the main groups that existed in the first century, he lists Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. That's how he frames them. And while it's really interesting, a lot of times the Matthean community is viewed as the one that's responding to the Pharisees, because we imagine that the book of Matthew is written roughly in the year 85 CE. So that means that there still would have been Pharisees around, as we mentioned, like some of my favorite people are Pharisees. I identify personally as a Pharisee, and therefore it's really interesting that the only person who would really group Pharisees and Sadducees is someone who's really not dealing with them on a day-to-day basis. They are the other. And this is one of the ways that we bifurcate the Christian versus Jewish community. We talk about how parting of the ways didn't really take place till really the end of the century and over the next
So
300 years.
would you say for sake of simplicity, that the Pharisees would be the conservative part of the religion, the Sadducees would be the most liberal part of the religion? Is that
So
is that
we definitely cannot say that, because even
okay?
within the Pharisaic tradition, when we have the schools of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, there's liberal and non and conservative elements to both of those. Generally, historians, it's really hard to speak them in general sense. Historians generally view the Sadducees as the priestly, Jerusalem, economically wealthy class. It's
That's liberal, right? I mean, the politically liberal left in America. I mean, just broadly speaking.
so they were. That's a big generalization.
Yeah.
But again, I do want to point out that the Pharisees definitely did have those elements, and the Pharisees, at least if you look at like 1950s American conservative movement, where you look at like if you look at the famous authors on these works, they'll view that as a class warfare kind of argument. And I do think the class warfare argument does make sense compared to Christians, because the Christians are definitely trying to separate themselves from this group. And while they identified as the Jews, the Pharisaic Judaism was definitely, it looks like, was they're trying to push to the other side. And I think we can't even talk about the Pharisees and Sadducees without noting that this is a specifically Matthean argument, because Luke in 3:7-9 in Luke, it says that brood of vipers, you warned you to flee from the wrath to come. It totally omits any mention of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So most scholars would view this obviously as a Matthean inclusion, which means he's trying to separate from that community. And I think we need to identify these two communities. Number one. Number two, we talked about how John the Baptist is geographically centrally located. And the very fact that the Pharisees are coming here, and Sadducees, we need to kind of identify what were they trying to accomplish, so that we talk about there's maybe three different versions for possibilities. They could be coming because they want this metaphysical benefit. They could want to see the charismatic leader, or they might want to argue against his mission, saying this is something that's other, this is something that's bad, this is something that we want to go to, we want to ignore. But so when you look at the verse, we really only see John's response to the group. We don't really see exactly what they want. And we talked about how there's what is his preaching, and then we'll be able to see a group of what he really is trying to accomplish here. So you noted how you thought there's a weird thing to say, to call like why does John speak so harshly? And we know that Jesus uses the same exact language in 12:34. in Matthew.
So yeah, so back in the first century, would these have been harsh to them? Was this culturally acceptable? Like in today's day and age, these words are very harsh and it's culturally not acceptable to call a person or a group you brood of vipers. It's just not okay, right?
I
Now
think maybe
back in
maybe it's something we could start doing in the world, see how it goes, how culture accepted. We'll go around people that we like or don't like and say, "Oh, brood of vipers," and see how
well,
they respond.
yeah. So in John's time or in the Matthew community's time, were these acceptable words, or were these words meant to elicit a form of, again, how to anger or
Condemnation and anger, right? So all we I can't tell you if it's the equivalent of a curse word. Is it like saying the F word, or is it like saying something bad? But it's definitely viewed in 12:34 in Matthew and 23:33 when he says it to the non-Pharisees,
Mhm.
that Jesus, this is one of the main marks that we see. Jesus is impacted by John, or at least is existing in the same culture community, and that their same kind of curse exists. Because even as we mentioned, even when you look at it from a biblical perspective, that we have vipers were in the desert by, or snakes were in the desert by Moses, and that the people there are getting bitten, and we have the snakes in the earlier in Genesis. But I'm not sure if those metaphysical or symbolic elements of snake really kind of do justice here to explain why he calls them a group of snakes. It seems like you're saying, it maybe is just a cultural negative term that they would use in first century.
Yeah, I mean, because these words should probably mean something in today's day and age. These are not culturally accepted terms, and so now I don't. It sounded like it sounds like these words were meant to draw out, again, not so much condemnation, but more a response from them. By saying this, to saying a response to them, like, or either it was meant
Well,
to
if it's meant
startle
to be a
them.
response, it doesn't give them a chance to respond, right?
Yeah.
And again, we look at 12:34 when Jesus says it, which I can never find because this book doesn't go in order. Oh, here it is. When Jesus says it, right here. Well, I'm lying. I can't find it. My book doesn't go in order, so we're gonna have to deal with that. But when Jesus says it, it's also just meant to be like the other and dealing with the group. So I'm not sure if it's more than that. Okay. We also noted that he said to them, "You brood of," when he saw many Pharisees and Sadducees coming from coming for baptism. So it's interesting
Who
that
want to?
he viewed them as coming for the baptism. So it wasn't necessarily only just trying to access the idea of John, but he's trying to kind of, it looks like, at least from this verse, he's trying to they're buying into at least a little bit of what he's trying to sell. So in certain translations, it says his baptism, or in some translations, it says the baptism. So if it's his baptism, it would be the importance of John in this actual situation, versus the baptism, it would just be his movements. Okay, the verse has really two more interesting things. So number one, it says, from the wrath to come. He warned them to flee from the wrath to come. So the wrath to come, I think I asked you, would you identify wrath with Christianity today? Is
Yeah.
that one of the words you would imagine the kingdom of heaven?
I think it's one aspect of it. I mean, but I don't want to equate wrath to all there is to the kingdom of heaven. I think there's enough in the scriptures which point to the coming kingdom associated with wrath and some form of judgment, as in the elimination of evil, right? And so there's
Right,
some
like,
that it's in that context we feel wrath, as in there's so much of evil happening in this world in all shapes and form, and so it's wrath as in being poured out to cast out evil in the coming messianic kingdom or the coming kingdom of God. And so is wrath a part of it? Yes, but I don't see wrath as being a continuum in the kingdom of heaven or the
right.
messianic kingdom or.
And it's interesting when we talked about the day of the Lord that's mentioned in Ezekiel 7:19 or Zephaniah 1:18, or that in Malachi that Elijah is going to come. When they imagine the day of the Lord and being like this interference of God into natural things, they probably imagined, the Pharisees and Sadducees, if those who were messianic about it would have probably viewed this as a punishment for the people who weren't followers of Judaism or tradition. If anything, this is a specifically biting condemnation, that the wrath all of a sudden applies not only to the people who aren't following the message, but it's the people who aren't anticipating the day of the Lord, the kingdom of heaven, in the way that John says. So these Pharisees probably would have thought, the day of wrath, the day of the Lord, doesn't apply to me. And all of a sudden we have John coming along and saying, you guys are the hegemony of the Jewish people right now, and it applies equally to you.
So I have one question. Like one question, is that something we discussed yesterday? Was John trained by a rabbi, or was he just self-taught? In terms
So
of his,
it's interesting. I think everyone would have been mentored at that time. I think
yeah.
the idea of like ordination and training would have been very different in the first century. So I would say we definitely have to view him as a product of first century Judaism at a certain level. The fact that he's speaking Old Testament language, the fact that he's
Hmm.
speaking kingdom of heaven, the fact that he's speaking repent, the fact that he
Hmm.
uses immersing or baptism as a symbolic or even metaphysical way to purify yourself. These are all first century concepts that would have been normal for him, but we don't actually speak about his predecessor because he is the predecessor. He's the one who comes and announces Jesus. If we actually started talking about his predecessor, we're gonna get a chicken and egg situation. We'll probably go back to Adam.
Hmm.
Like, who is training who?
Yeah. So
Okay, yeah,
training as not so much his predecessor, but as in somebody who shaped his way, somebody who shaped his thinking as it was formative in in how he came to see himself and the world around him.
yeah, 100%. Okay, and the last concept we talked about is the idea of that who warned you to flee from the wrath. So the idea of fleeing, and I want to note the irony that the people who were coming from Jerusalem to the wilderness are the ones who are asking, or at least viewed from John the Baptist, to flee. If anything, they are doing that. If anything, Jerusalem is the place where you go back to, and the center of Judaism, but that
Mhm.
they are fleeing from that symbolic thing to John the Baptist. So it's really interesting that we use that language. Okay, Isaac, I think we'll call unless you want to say something more. We'll call that a day.
Yeah,
And okay, great.